Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I am happy to be meeting once again with Dean Krosecz of the People I Meet podcast. So thank you, Dean, for dropping into Mind Shift Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I had a great conversation. What was it, about a month or so ago, where we met, I guess, for the first time on Twitter, I think it was. And I was on your show. That was really interesting, chatting a little bit. We had a lot in common coming out of evangelicalism, but you come out of more of a charismatic background.
That's absolutely correct. I became a Christian July 9th, 1989 in an Assemblies of God church. And I was told, even before I actually committed, I was told I needed to be filled with the Holy Spirit and speak in other tongues. Or as they said it back then, filled with the Holy Ghost and speak.
Holy Ghost.
And get your heavenly language or your prayer language.
That's right. So did you speak in tongues and all that?
All the time.
All the time.
Yes.
Yeah. Fortunately for me, I came out of what they call a cessationist background. Mm-hmm. Which means, for people that don't know the theology, that means our tradition didn't believe in the gifts of tongues and miracles and healings and prophecy for today. We said it was certainly a gift in the book of Acts, but we said it ceased after the first century. So we would have been, if we were both evangelicals, we would have been probably having a huge argument.
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually, in the early 90s, maybe the mid 90s, I met this guy. We were both waiting for the bus in Houston, and he was witnessing to everybody around him, and he was super intense. And it turned out he was a convert from Islam, and I befriended him. I was like, man, let's go street witnessing together, you know?
Yeah,
and
let's do this thing.
And he wouldn't, because he found out pretty quick that I spoke in tongues, and he was like, no way, man, you're filled with the devil. I'm not gonna. I'm like,
it's amazing. I remember listening to Dr. John MacArthur, although I've since found out that doctor is actually an honorary doctorate. So he shouldn't really call himself Dr. John MacArthur. But anyway, I'm sure you've come across John MacArthur's stuff, because he argues that charismatics who speak in tongues are actually being fooled by demons. So that's a whole nother thing. So we would have been arguing, whether or not that was a thing as well back in the day, probably. See, although I never believed what MacArthur was arguing, but I didn't believe in the gift of tongues for sure. So yeah, we couldn't have been friends, man. Sorry.
Yeah.
We can be now, though.
This is a good thing.
That's like good to know. Yeah. And then we found out what we also have in common is we're both musicians. I'm a drummer, you're a guitar player / that sounds like you play a lot of instruments, but you played in worship bands for years, which was the same as me. I played in worship bands, and we did youth concerts and camps and all sorts of stuff all over the place. So we could have played music together.
Yeah.
We still could, actually.
Yeah, we could.
We could.
Yeah.
If you ever come over to North Wales, we'll jam, or I'll come down where you're at.
Awesome. That
cool.
Sounds good. Yeah. I'd rather come to you instead of you coming here.
We're all set up. We've got a complete PA. All my drums are set up. All you got to do is plug in, and we're away.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
So that's cool.
You can see over my right shoulder. The audience can't, I know, but you can see over my right shoulder. My old PA system is sitting there, stacked up.
Oh, that's not a good place for a PA. It needs to be plugged in and set up somewhere.
Yeah, but I moved to this tiny little house in the Poconos. It's only 1,000 square feet, and there's just no room anywhere.
I hear you. Luckily for us, we're in a very small house too, but down the street from us, there's a complete detached garage, and we just leave our stuff set up. So when it's band practice, I walk down the hill, open the door, jump behind my drums, and I'm rocking within minutes. So it's very handy. I'm very, very lucky, because for years we had a practice space near Chester, which is just across the border into England. I used to have to pack my drums up and haul them out there, set everything up, tear them all down, and then come back. I hear your dogs barking in the background too.
You know, Australian blue heelers, they're really, really smart.
Yes, they are.
But they're not smart enough to understand when to do their job and when not to.
I know. We have a dog. It's the same thing. When I'm doing a podcast, if I'm here by myself, my wife's away, inevitably someone will come to the door or she'll bark. She can be quiet all day long. But anyway, yeah. So we were saying we both had music in common, but you came from the charismatic side. What's your take now? Okay, so you walked away from it all. What
I
led
did.
you to walk away from not just the charismatic thing, but evangelicalism, Christianity as a whole?
I don't think you and I have time at the moment to go through my whole Christian career, which went from 1989 to January 1st, 2015.
Right. To give us the short summary, I guess.
So in 2008, I started what was called the Open Heavens movement in Houston. And we can't get into all the details regarding that, but I started it on a word given to me by Paul Keith Davis, who is a famous quote unquote prophet here in America. He's famous all around the world, but most people outside of the US have never heard of him. And we started to get pretty big crowds right away. And basically it was, I would invite the Christians in the city to meet me in a park in downtown Houston to worship and pray for the city. And we started to get pretty big crowds right away. And I realized fairly quickly, I'm not qualified. I'm really good at leading worship. I'm a pretty good worship songwriter, and I'm really good at leading worship and leading people through an experience, quote unquote, with the Holy Spirit and with God. I am not qualified to lead a group of people. I guess theologically, I wanted to make sure, because we had people from all different types of churches coming. And so I started researching different churches and traditions so that I could communicate with people. And it was my first exposure to, oh my gosh, there's this gigantic plethora of Christian traditions that are nowhere near as militant and fascist, basically, as the charismatic church. These people have what I deemed the most important parts of the gospel. They had it down, which was love God, love people, right? And they were nothing like what the group that I ran with were like. And I was like, this is interesting. And so I started studying theology. And as I started studying theology, and by the way, I was 40 years old when I'd already been a Christian for over 20 years, but I started studying theology. And as I was studying theology, I was like, I need to learn philosophy as well, because theology and philosophy are really, they're like a rope. They're just like a 3-stranded rope, right? The way it wraps around each other. And so I need to learn how philosophers think. And I knew as an artist, I wasn't going to be great at it, but I needed to learn. And as I started to learn philosophy and started to learn theology, I realized, I get to ask questions here. I asked a lot of questions in my Christian life, but usually they just pissed people off. And so I generally kept them to myself or just did research myself after a certain period of time. But in theology, the very first thing you learn, I believe in Charnock's from like the 1400s, the existence and attributes of God.
Right.
And there was another systematic theology book that I bought at Lifeway that I studied a lot. It was basically a Southern Baptist systematic theology. But the first thing you learn is the omnis. God is omnipresent, he's omniscient, and he's omnipotent, right? He's everywhere at all times. He is all-knowing, he's all-powerful. And my whole thing about Jesus and the New Testament, besides the social part of it, I mean, I was really big into helping the homeless, doing prison ministry, reaching out to people. Those were my focuses all the time. But in the New Testament, Jesus was all about God is your father. God is your father. He loves you. He's your father. You're his kid. And then John, who was Jesus's best friend, said, God is love. And when I put those 5 together, and I asked a very, very simple question, I said, wait a minute. If God knows me, he's all knowing. He knows me better than I know myself. He's my father and he loves me. He is love. And he also is all powerful and he's everywhere at all times. Number one, why do you let all this shit that happened to me in my life happen. But number two, why can't he just speak to each and every one of us in a way that we get it? If he really is all these things, shouldn't he be a better communicator than Tony Robbins or Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Right? Nobody could give me a decent answer. And I couldn't find one in the Bible. I don't know about you, but in 25 and a half years, 26 years, I read the Bible through 17 times.
Sure. Yeah. I did too.
There's books in the New Testament that I've read hundreds of times, 400 or 500 times. And I could not find a decent answer. And the only answer I would really get that came anywhere close was, well, it's not for us to judge God. He's so much smarter than us. We can't possibly hope to understand. I was like, nope, that is not okay. Nope.
Yeah. Why is it so difficult? Even the Bible is not easy to understand.
Correct.
You know, I mean, like you say, you could read it hundreds of times. I have a friend who's a pastor, and he reads through the Bible. He's got this Bible reading program that he institutes every single year. And I'm sure you did the same thing. You divvy it up into a certain number of chapters every day. And if you do that plan, you'll read through the whole Bible in a year. And there's still sections that are completely inscrutable, you know, that you go, what is Ezekiel talking about? What's, you know, Daniel talking about, these prophecies and apocalyptic literature? Why isn't that more clear? You know, even that's hard to understand. People have been arguing about it for millennia now. What does it mean?
You know, I would hear expository preachers a lot of times talk about, well, you know, you have to understand when you're reading these writings, you have to understand the culture of the time. And it's like, no,
the historical context.
No, he's supposed to be everywhere at all times. So even back then, God understood the culture of today, whether it's in Bhutan or in Baltimore. God understood the culture. If he's everywhere at all times and all knowing, he should have been able to speak in a way that was applicable to them back there and to you know, the disparate cultures here in the U.S. He should have been able to do that, or in the modern world, not just the U.S. And obviously he couldn't, or he chose not to. And which one's worse?
I remember that problem. I had the same exact problem as you did, because I remember going through Bible college and asking those same kind of questions. They were telling us that you had to, like you said, you had to understand the original historical context. So let's say you're reading the book of 1st or 2nd Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians, as Donald Trump calls it. But you had to, in a sense, like get in a time machine and go back to ancient Corinth, 1st century Corinth, and sort of put yourself, which is impossible. And my argument was, why do we have to do that? It's not possible for somebody in Bhutan or somewhere. And the answer always was, well, it's the principles that the Bible is communicating. They're transcendent. They transcend cultures. But I found that's not a good enough answer, because the principle is an interpretation of a text. So that's still subjective. You know, that's a potential problem. My principle that I glean from the text may not be the one you glean from the same text. So we're going to argue about who speaks in tongues today, and we're going to say it's from the same passage, you know? So that doesn't really work.
If God loved the people who were holding Samson captive, why did he let Samson kill them?
Exactly. Yeah. That's another whole weird story, isn't it? He's like the ultimate anti-hero, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, so you're studying philosophy, studying theology, coming up with actually more problems and questions than answers. Is that what ended up doing you in?
That, and I kept diverging further and further from not just the charismatic church, but from the evangelical church. And I tend to be a very black and white thinker. It's one of my greatest weaknesses. And in late 2001, early 2002, I was okay. And I know that sounds, now looking back, if I hear a Christian say they're okay with us going to war, it sounds really weird. But for me, with Afghanistan, I was okay with us going to war. I wanted us to not be boots on the ground or conventional armies on the ground. I wanted us to just do special forces because I knew it was going to be really ugly if we put a full army in there. I was dubious about the dubious. That's a bad way to describe it. I was unsure about the Iraq war, but I got on board. And then by 2006, I was back saying, no, this was completely wrong. We never should have done this. This is just evil. So I was really at odds with the charismatic church. It was around 2006, 2007, where the go big, go small, or go home. And I was like, go home. And, the rest of the church was like, how dare you? President Bush is anointed by God to do this. And I was like, no, he's not.
It's a huge mistake.
Yeah. And then by 2008, when I was starting the Open Heavens Project, I was already at the point where I was like, I understand the church's opposition to gay marriage, but the church is not supposed to be setting the laws. That's the whole point of America, the United States of America anyway. And so I was like, we need to let gay marriage go through. We need to let this happen. And, that was another big thing. I was trying to walk this line of, I'm not endorsing homosexuality right now. I'm like, yes, I do. Yeah. Leave people alone, man.
Yeah. Let them do their thing.
But I was like, I'm not endorsing homosexuality. I'm just saying you can't make it illegal. That's really awful for you to do, for you to tell people how they should live. If Jesus wasn't doing it, you shouldn't do it. Right. And so there was
increasingly out of step then with the sort of party line, it sounds like.
Yeah. And then things just went downhill from there. And I was having more and more clashes with, the people that I ran with. I was in more and more disagreement. I was asking bigger and bigger questions. And then my mother got sick. She got really sick. And I was taking care of her. I was taking care of her 14 hours a day. I was a single dad with 3 kids, trying to get, all 3 of them through their teen years without killing themselves, somebody else, or knocking somebody up.
Or right? You. Yeah. Or you, right? Yeah, doing something.
Yeah. And I was taking care of my mother at the same time and running my school and running the ministry. Eventually things had to give because I was already approaching my mid-40s. I wasn't taking care of myself very well, and I had way too many responsibilities. I closed my school because I was taking care of my mother and my kids. I was becoming a really lousy teacher. I desperately needed help after about 15 months, right around the time that my mother finally passed away. I was in really bad shape financially. Everything was gone. And, we were having trouble buying enough groceries every week.
Wow.
And I remember I asked a few churches for help, churches that knew me, and they were like, well, we can't really help you. And then I asked this one retired pastor who shall remain nameless, and he looked me right in the eye and he said, "You're worse than an infidel." And I was like,
"Why are you an infidel?"
He said, "Because you refuse to work."
Oh, right. If a man doesn't work, he will not eat. So that's what the Bible says.
Yeah. And if a man will not take care of his own family, he's worse than an infidel.
Right. Yeah.
And I was like, the reason I can't work is because I'm so busy taking care of my family, you asshole.
Wow.
But instead of saying that, I simply just thanked him, got up and walked away and never talked to him again. That was way over the line.
Right. So they gave you the cold shoulder, basically, after all you'd done for them. I mean, that sounds so familiar. Speaking as an ex-pastor myself, I can tell you, man, I spent 12 years working at a church in Portland only to get screwed over and lied about and gossiped about. And after all the years of faithful service, they didn't give a damn at the end.
Right.
I was the worst person in the world, unbelievable.
Yes. Yeah. I was, I took some time after my mother passed away in 2014. I took a few months off to get myself and my family back together and try and get us to some kind of healthy point. And then I restarted my school, and I was okay. And then a church hired me to be the worship leader. I was fine leading worship there. I was fine with the pastor. Everything was fine. And he brought a speaker in who was an ex-truck driver, and he was a big, strong guy. Even he was in his late 50s, early 60s, and he was still really intimidating. And as we spent the week with this guy, he was just a total con man. There was nothing godly about this man in any way, shape, or form. And I was just sick of him. And by the final service of the week, because he was there for for an entire week, he was there ministering to people. And for the final service, he told this story of when he was still driving a truck, a prostitute came up to his truck, and she put her hands on the window because he was sitting with the window open, just relaxing. She put her hands on his window in the truck and said, "Hey, are you looking for a date?" And this gigantic man said he reached over with his left hand and grabbed her left wrist. And he reached over with his right hand and grabbed his Bible, and he opened up his Bible and started reading Bible verses to her. And she was terrified, saying, "Let me go. Let me go. What are you doing? Let me go." And he said, and by the time I was done reading those verses to her, she was shaking and crying under the conviction of the Holy Ghost. And I couldn't take it. And I basically just grabbed my guitar when I was done and ran out of the church and went home. I was furious, and I was going to cuss him out and get punched out. Right. I was going to get beat up by this old man.
Sounds like she was just afraid and scared of him.
Yes. And
more than anything.
And the pastor took me to lunch. The pastor was like, "I got to know what in the world was going on. You look like you were in complete pain." About? And I was like, "I was." And I told him, this guy, and I just laid into the pastor. I was like, "This guy is not a Christian. He's not godly. He's a total con man." And I said, that woman was not under the conviction of the Holy Spirit. She was terrified. She had no idea what this psycho was going to do to her.
So what are you doing bringing this guy in here?
Yeah. And he's like, "Brother, you got to calm down. You got to be careful. You can't say things like that. You don't know." I was like, "No, I know the Holy Spirit. I don't need to be careful."
Yeah. This guy's a friggin' con artist.
Yeah. And he fired me. He gave me a month's pay. And was like, "You're done."
So you made a stand and got burned for it.
Yeah. And that wasn't the first time. And, most of my Christian life, stuff like that would happen. I was always like, "God, what's wrong with me? Why won't you fix me? I keep insulting these pastors. I keep insulting these people, and I get fired, or they don't want to work with me anymore. What's going on? Why don't you fix me and help me be more diplomatic or more socially aware?
And why can't I fit in?"
Yeah. And I, at that point, I was pretty done. And I was like, "Okay, I'm going to take December off from ministry, not teaching." I was still teaching. And I said, "I'm going to take December off from ministering, and I'm just going to pray, and you need to speak to me. And if you don't speak to me, I'm done."
Right, I'm out.
and I would get up every morning and pray. And just literally lay on the floor face down, waiting to hear, and the entire month, and heard nothing. And I admit I showed up January 1st, January 2nd, January 3rd, just to be sure, just to be like, "Oh, well, I don't want to tell God what he has to do." And I heard, and I was like, "No, I'm done. I did."
Maybe
this
he's
is just
testing you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just, he's busy right now. I'll get back to you. I'll have my people call your people.
Yeah.
We'll do lunch,
Yeah. And at that point I was just, okay, the problem here is I just don't believe any of this anymore. And
that would do it.
Yeah, I was done. One of the things that my oldest, he's about to turn 29 now. So he was in his 20s when he said this, but he wasn't as mature as he is now. He's like about 6 or 7 months in, maybe a year in. He came to me. He said, "Dad, what's going on? What's different?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're not as scared." I was like, "Wow, how about that?"
Yeah. What about that?
Yeah, because I don't know about the non-charismatic evangelical church, but in the charismatic church, you're always scared, because if you make a wrong decision, you ruin your life, your kids go to hell, you can't recover from it, blah, 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 right? It's all fear, which is why one of the reasons they're so drawn to Donald Trump, because he stokes that fear. They're addicted to fear already. And he stokes it. He pokes it, and they're like, "Oh, my guy."
Yeah, he inflames that fear, doesn't he?
Yeah,
the master at it.
Yeah, but that was pretty amazing that my son saw the difference, and he's like, "You're not scared anymore." And I was like, "Wow, I'm not."
Yeah, you probably didn't even realize it.
Yeah,
Pick someone else to see it who knows you. They can see the change. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. And he actually, I don't want to get emotional, so I gotta, but he said to me, he said, "It feels good not being worried about what you did wrong, not being able to figure out what you did wrong, doesn't it?" And I was like, "Yeah, it does. Yeah,
Yeah.
It really does. Like, why am I being punished? I know I wasn't the nicest person before I became a Christian. I made 3 or 4 mistakes that were bigger than the average American male teenager makes. But, I knew people who were way worse than me before they got saved, and they got saved and they had very good lives, quote unquote. Right. And I couldn't understand, what did I do that was so horrible, that I deserve to continue to suffer like this all these years when I'm doing everything I know to do. And he said, yeah, it feels good not to have to worry about that anymore, doesn't it? I was like, yeah, it does.
But think about it from a cult psychology point of view. We were talking about this before we hit record, that if you look at what you're just describing from a cult psychology, okay, so you came into the church and you tried to conform, you tried to fit in, but you just couldn't get it done because, as I would see it now, that was actually your authentic self. That was who you actually are. And yet you couldn't put on the religious veneer enough to sort of fit in and conform and placate everybody. Maybe you could do that for some time, but eventually, like you said, with this issue of this quote unquote truck driver con artist guy, you had to say something, and you called him out and you got the screw job over it. And yet they kicked you to the curb. And that's exactly what cults do. And the troublemaker, in air quotes, the person who's always raising objections and saying, wait a minute, what are we doing here? No, you're that nail that's sticking up that's got to be hammered down, so that's a classic story. And then when you leave, your authentic self basically reasserts itself, and you actually become who you really were all along, but you didn't have to put the veneer of religiosity over the top of it.
Yeah.
That's my armchair psychology sort of take on your story.
Yeah. And the questions that I was always raising is, why are we spending all this money on buildings and utilities when, we're supposed to be helping the poor? And
90% of the church's budget is all overheads, salaries, buildings, mission funds, blah, blah, blah. Very, very little, maybe 8 or 9, 10% goes to actual community outreach and care for the poor and the needy. That's a vast sort of thing that keeps itself going. It props itself up.
Right. And, I would ask people, we have people here who need help. Why aren't we helping them? Right. They're with us. They're here every week with us. Why aren't we helping them? Well, they won't help themselves.
Yeah. They're infidels.
It's like, no, you're not, and I would ask simple questions like, wait a minute, you're telling me that a single mom of 3 kids making minimum wage doesn't deserve our help because she doesn't tithe when she makes like 60% of what her monthly bills are, and it's her fault because she doesn't tithe? Wait, not only are we that vindictive, is God that vindictive?
Apparently he is. Well, they would say, wouldn't the charismatics say, and even the evangelicals would say, because she didn't make God her first priority, you got to give out of your need, out of your want. Isn't that what they say? That if she'd have given her 10% up front, regardless of the fact she couldn't pay her bills, God would come across for her and give her 100-fold or 1,000-fold. That's the sort of charismatic prosperity gospel.
Right. And
what a system.
Yeah, I would always think, and that's why you're driving a Lexus and I'm driving this $1,500 piece of crap that barely stays together.
Yeah, the pastor's driving a Mercedes and a Lexus, and you look around the parking lot and people are driving beaters and bangers, and it works for the preacher though, man.
Yeah. I have to be very careful. So I don't say names because I don't want to get sued. That's literally why I won't say names. But I remember there's one particular prosperity preacher here in America who announced that he was personally worth $500 million.
Good God.
And my first question was, okay, why does anybody in that man's church have a house payment?
Yeah, he's got the money to just pay the whole thing off.
Yeah, for his entire congregation.
Yep.
What are we doing here?
What's happening?
And I heard that same guy say one time, "Oh, I stopped giving cars away."
Why?
And he's like, because I've got over 20 cars in my driveway. Every one of them's worth over $100,000. And every time I give one away, I get 2 or 3 more. And it's like, no, that's
crazy. When we come back from the break, we're going to get into Dean's time in charismatic Christianity, and specifically, we're going to talk about the 7 mountains mandate dominion theology that Dean was involved in as well during his time in charismatic evangelicalism. We're also going to try to unpack what in the world Paula White-Cain was talking about the other day when she was just after the election, when she was ranting and railing, and I'm sure you've seen this clip. It's gone viral. People have absolutely taken the piss out of this and set it to music and all sorts of things, but she was ranting about angels being dispatched and declaring the sound of victory. What in the world was all that about? Dean's going to help us make sense of the madness, so we're going to get into that in the second half of this episode. I just wanted to mention really quickly a quick thank you to Sylvia as well as to Tim Bowman, who have recently become the 2 latest supporters of this show on Patreon. Your support is greatly appreciated. It helps me cover my monthly expenses in bringing you this show. If you want to support the show, the links, as always, are in the show notes to my Patreon page. What do you get for being a supporter of this show? There's some really great benefits. For one thing, I always release the episodes early on Patreon. Usually they come out on Wednesday before they drop on Fridays everywhere else. You also get to be added into our closed Mindshift Podcast Facebook group, and it's in there that we do our monthly Mindshift Zoom calls. We just had one with Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry of Taking America Back for God, and in fact, if you want to see that call, I have recently uploaded it to my Mindshift Podcast Facebook page, but next month we're going to have Frank Schaefer coming in, so that is an absolutely amazing thing to have Frank Schaefer come back, and also we're going to be doing another episode. I'm nearly finished with his book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, so look for that episode with Frank Schaefer coming up as soon as I can schedule a time to talk with him. And then finally, if you support the show at a $5 a month level, I will send you a really cool gift only available from here in Wales. In fact, just yesterday I was in the little town of Mold. Yes, that's actually a town in North Wales, and stores are starting to reopen. I went to the Mold market and I got some of the gifts that I send to people, so I'm really happy. I've just started sending those back out. I couldn't get stuff because everything was on lockdown here, so that's cool if you want to support the show. If you support it at a $10 a month level, I'll send you a free Mindshift Podcast t-shirt. So some cool benefits to being a supporter of the show on Patreon. I just wanted to mention, too, what is coming up in the next few episodes here on the show. In 2 weeks, I've got an episode with Rebecca Drumsta. She's a life coach, and she's a survivor like me of a fundamentalist Bible cult sort of upbringing. We have a lot in common. We had a really good discussion, so that's a great episode, a great conversation. I also talked to Seven, who's a rapper out of Jacksonville, Florida. What an amazing story, talking about his time as it turns out, the only black guy on the church staff, an all-white church staff, a mega church down in the South. He's got just an unbelievable story. I think I'm the first podcast that he's actually been on where he's speaking out about how the church really screwed him over. And so that's kind of a heartbreaking story, actually, but there's hope at the end of it. And then just tonight, as I'm doing this recording, this is now the 29th of November, I'm going to be talking with Bonnie and Karen from the Deconversion Therapy podcast. So I think we'll drop that as a bonus episode coming up soon. It's going to be released actually on both platforms. So I'm really excited to be finally meeting up with Bonnie and Karen. We've been talking about doing a podcast together forever. So look for that bonus episode with the gals from the Deconversion Therapy podcast. All right, enough of the business. Let's get back into the conversation with Dean Krosecz as we now get into this issue of charismatic theology, especially around this 7 mountains mandate dominion theology. What's that all about? We're going to continue to explore Dean's escape from charismatic Christianity. You came out of the charismatic movement. Now, as we're doing this recording, it's the end of the first election week, and it's completely chaotic. By the time this episode drops, the election, something will be known. Were you in the whole charismatic political side? Because I've touched on this in other podcasts, the whole 7 mountains mandate and all that sort of charismatic dominion theology. Were you into all that stuff as well?
So as a Christian, I was introduced to conservative talk radio very early on. I got addicted pretty quickly. When I started the Open Heavens Project in 2008, one of the first books I read was the Seven Mountain Mandate, I think it was. And I bought that book for all of my leaders. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the thing.
Key.
Yeah. Now think about what I just told you about in 2008 coming out for or just not against gay marriage, right? And yet I read the Seven Mountain Mandate and bought it for all my leaders. That cognitive dissonance just really didn't exist. I didn't notice it, right? Because I didn't know how to think critically.
Sure.
It was just, it was the God said it, I believe it crap, right? That's God said it, I believe it, that settles it, right? That was the
bumper sticker theology, they call it.
Yeah.
Spare me your bumper sticker theology. I remember saying that to people when I was a pastor.
I was not officially recognized by anybody in that movement, but I was teaching it to my people, and I was trying to find ways to live it as best I could.
So what's the basic thrust? What's the purpose of this so-called Seven Mountains Mandate? What is it? Can you talk us through it?
I can a little bit.
Right.
Remember, I didn't write the book. I read it several times. I didn't write it, and I've been out of it for a long time. Right. So the seven mountain mandate, the seven mountains are, there's basically the theory goes, there's seven parts of society, and that's religion, government, arts and entertainment, media or news. I think it's news, media. What's left?
You got education and government, I would say, are probably the final two.
Government.
Well, religion is one too.
Right. So religion and government are the first two, right? Those are the, and then so, but there's supposed to be seven of them, and I can't remember all seven of them.
I think you got them all though.
Okay, and the whole point is Christians should be leaders in all seven of these. We should find ways to take over these seven areas of society so that we can, quote unquote, be guided by the Holy Spirit and make godly policies. The better way to say that is form a Christian fascist government.
Okay, even though that's not their words.
Those are the words of Chris Hedges. He was fired / resigned from the New York Times because he came out against the Iraq War before the Iraq War started.
That would do it.
Yeah, he was a foreign correspondent for many years for the New York Times, and he saw what we were doing, what the U.S. government was doing all over the world, basically starting wars, killing people.
Yeah, they're illegal wars, a lot of them. And they're against Muslim nations, which obviously plays a big part in the Islamophobia as well. But so going back to the seven mountains, the argument goes that Christians should be sitting atop these seven cultural mountains.
Yes.
And making policies and sort of leading and ruling. If that was the case, what would the world look like? Are you describing a theocracy here? Is that what we're talking about?
That's absolutely what we're talking about. When I first looked into it in somewhere between 2009 and 2012, I was not really, they were shying away from that rhetoric. They were saying, no. We need to be led by God to bring about godly policies and be led by the Holy Spirit. But now they don't even try to hide it. They want a theocracy. And some of them even come out and say it. They want to institute a theocracy. And some of them even think, I just cannot figure out why, but they think that Donald Trump was going to bring about a theocracy or is going to bring about a theocracy, because this is, today is Friday, November 6th. People are
election's still in doubt. Yeah.
It's still in doubt. They have, most of the news agencies have declared Biden the winner. They've said he's got like 285 electoral college votes or delegates, but this thing isn't over. There's a reason Trump wanted that third Supreme Court justice on the court, and there's a reason it was Amy Coney Barrett.
It was no accident
in this stuff. And the Republicans have proven they're really good. The Republicans combined with the Supreme Court, they're really good at stealing elections. They're really good at it. So
they've worked the system.
Yeah, and if you do some research, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and one other, it might have been
Gorsuch. Yeah, they're all Catholics.
And they were all involved in Bush v. Gore.
Yeah,
2000.
That's what I was going to say. They all had a role in that.
Yeah,
which is another kind of a stolen election. The recount was stopped at a certain point when Bush was in the lead. They're like, okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Which is what Trump's trying to do right now. As we're doing this recording, he wants to stop the votes from being counted that are supposedly quote unquote fraudulent and late and all the rest of it.
Right. He has zero evidence.
Yeah.
And
there is no voter fraud.
Yeah. He doesn't want the votes counted where Biden was either catching up to him or is ahead of him, but he wants the votes counted where he's catching up to Biden. Right.
Yeah. Really selective system there. But now going back to the Seven Mountains thing, what's the charismatic angle? Because one thing I've learned, and that is that in theory, okay, you've got these sort of dominionists, guys like, let's say, the Family Research Council or Ralph Drollinger Capital Ministries. These are not charismatic ministries. That's part of Focus on the Family and places like that. They're not charismatic, but they're starting to use the rhetoric of Seven Mountains. They're throwing out those terms. They're using the wording. But what I'm finding is this is kind of crossing over now. But what is the specific charismatic emphasis to the whole Seven Mountains piece? Because it's all about spiritual warfare. People like Paula White-Cain and Lance Wallnau and Cindy Jacobs. These are big names within that movement.
Right. Well, that's what the Open Heavens Project was all about. What I and the movement were concentrating on was not, we were praying for the city of Houston specifically, and we were praying for God to have dominion over the city. And I was focused on really miracles and revival in the city of Houston. That was my thing. The leaders that you just mentioned, those guys all seem to be focused on power and money. Lance Wallnau is if memory serves, that guy, he's only part-time in the ministry. He's a businessman.
Right.
And I think he's, he may be like Donald Trump where he doesn't need to sleep much, and he may be full-time in both, like Tony Robbins. Right. Tony Robbins does the full-time seminar thing, but when he's done with that, he does it for like 12, 13 hours a day. And then when he's done with that, he goes and he runs his 52 businesses or whatever it is.
When does he sleep?
Yeah, he like Donald Trump, he sleeps 3 to 4 hours a night, and that's it.
Wow.
Lance Wallnau might be similar to that. I don't know. A lot of those business guys are. Mark Cuban is like that, but
very driven people. This is the guy who wrote God's Chaos Candidate. He's promoted the myth of Trump as the Cyrus figure, the whole Trump prophecy thing. He claims to have been a part of a prophecy that said Trump was going to get elected and all the rest of it. He's a big advocate of the Seven Mountains. But a big part of this is their emphasis on spiritual warfare. Because as I understand the movement, let's say, okay, you got a city like Houston, there's a territorial demon who's in charge, let's say, of the city of Houston. What you have to do is, first of all, identify who that demon is, pray strategically against that demon, get him kicked out of his throne, as it were. Then you can take over, climb the mountain, as it were, and take over. Is that basically how you understood it?
Yes. That's more spiritual mapping. Those two theories have combined in the Seven Mountain movement. And I know some people are like, spiritual mapping?
Yeah, what are you talking
about? Seven Mountains? What the heck are we? Yeah. This is all charismatic speak. And every cult, and it's not just a cult, every kind of closed community develops their own language, their own dialect,
their own jargon,
Christianese. You can call it, and it's Christianese, but the jazz players, the original jazz players, they did the same thing.
Sure.
Right. They came up with all these really cool words. And now who are the foremost neologists in the world? The people who create new words. Who are the foremost neologists in the world? It's the rap community. It's the hip hop community. They're constantly making up new words.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, the creativity. Right. Well, there's a lot of that goes on in the charismatic movement as well. And it's some of it is marketing. Some of it is wanting to come up with quick ways to explain things. Right. So you have this entire concept, you put it in 1 or 2 words or a phrase, and it's much easier to communicate and with each other when you're talking. You want to just get through stuff quickly.
Right. Now that would be what going back to this cult psychology, what Robert Lifton calls loaded language. So you take, like you just described, a couple of words, but you load them with a whole bunch of ideology or theology or philosophy. And to the insider, those words mean a whole lot. They mean a great deal, that to the average outsider, they're not going to understand what you mean when you say 7 mountains or spiritual mapping or territorial demons. So, for example, if people haven't seen it by now, this has gone viral, but Paula White-Cain, she had this insane ranting video. I guess it was filmed at her church the other day as we're doing this recording, where she's like calling on angels from Africa and South America to come to America to somehow assist in helping Donald Trump to win the election. That's got to be part of this whole maybe spiritual mapping, maybe certainly spiritual warfare. What was she doing in your estimation coming out of that movement yourself? What the hell was Paula White-Cain talking about?
There's something called, I have to be careful again. I don't want to get sued. And these people have a lot of money.
They do.
What she was doing is, in the charismatic movement, people believe that we have authority over angels, that we can, and I'm saying we, and I don't believe any of this anymore, right? But
that community.
But 7-8 years ago, I believed every single word of this. Okay.
You'd have been right there with them.
Yes. So you have dominion over angels. You have authority over angels, and you can command them or call on them to go do your bidding, because your bidding is God's bidding.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that is where we're at right now with this stuff. And it's incredibly dangerous. And there's nobody in leadership to talk these folks down.
Right.
So
no accountability, is there?
There's none.
They can just pretty much say whatever they want, and they all encourage each other and egg each other on, I think, don't they? Because one of the things I noticed before the COVID lockdown, they have like this circuit. They go from church to church. They all have these mega massive churches, and they all host these prophetic rallies and anointing ceremonies and all this. And they'll just go, like Paula White, she'll appear in Texas, and someone will go to Arizona, and someone else will go to Miami, and there's mega churches all over the place. And that's all they did, was just have these huge over the top rallies with tongues and miracles and healings, and supposedly, and that was their whole shtick, wasn't it?
Yes. And when I finally left, I didn't leave. I was kicked out again. One of the ministries that I was doing a lot of work for, I was traveling all over Texas playing bass in their worship band. And that's the most I can say. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But
you're in pretty deep.
Yeah. Yeah. But these folks were making a minimum of $5,000 a day to come speak at those conferences.
Right. So that was their fee they were charging. No speaker fee type thing.
Well, they don't charge.
Right. Oh, it's an offering.
The people who invite them make an offering. Hey,
a free will
invite
offering.
them. Hey, we're gonna invite you to this conference. We're gonna charge people to get into the conference, and then we're gonna take up offerings as well. Mm-hmm. And we will make sure we take care of you. And so they put them up in 4 and 5 star hotels. They pay for all their meals, and they would pay them at least $5,000 a day. I saw people get over $50,000, not in a day, in a service, in one service, and we were doing 3 services a day.
Right. So they're coming away with 100,000 plus, maybe more
in a week, right?
Just from offerings and free will gifts and all that.
Yeah, and who knows what else they were being given when, because it is not uncommon for somebody to walk up to somebody else and shake their hand and say, "God bless you, brother. You were so anointed today. It really spoke to me." And when they shake their hand, they're palming a check.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or cash.
Cash is better.
Yeah, that happened all the time.
Right, so these guys are raking it in.
Yeah, I didn't get much of that.
Books and videos and
and they would, and it always grated on me. Before they would minister, they would always market their books right there from the podium, and then the tables were in the back of the room, of these giant ballrooms that we would rent out. The tables were in the back, full of their books and their CDs and whatnot that they were selling. And I would always think, Jesus would come in here and dump those tables and beat the crap out of all these people, because he was a carpenter.
He was. He'd be overturning those tables.
And
he'd be making a whip out of something.
Snot out of us.
You gotta wonder. What a great racket, though. So these are some of these seven mountains people.
Yes.
Well, now this is the question. Okay, so getting back into the political aspect of these guys, we've seen Paula White-Cain ranting and raving all over the place. Her followers, you were telling me before we hit record, they've actually backed her up because it's gone viral. People are taking the piss, making all sorts of rap videos. I mean, it's crazy what she's doing.
Yes, and her followers were at one of at least one. They were probably at several. It's not the polling place; it's the place where they count the actual ballots. They're counting the votes. The people were outside. All of them had MAGA hats on. For those outside the U.S., that's Trump's "Make America Great Again" hats that he sold to make money. So it just makes sense. The Jesus Trump worshipers would buy the paraphernalia, but they're all in MAGA hats, and they're there praying on their knees, rocking back and forth, praying in tongues, declaring victory, as if God needed help to get. I thought he was God's man. Why would God need help?
That's what I thought.
How are they going to spin it?
If he loses, how do they spin that? Because he was God's anointed. He was the Cyrus. He was the breaker figure who was going to come in and smash everything up, which he certainly has done that.
Oh, yeah, he's definitely
whether or not that was prophetic, but he's against political correctness, and he's standing for all these sort of rights that evangelicals think are just, absolute. I was reading today, as a matter of fact, on the Family Research Council's website, I came across a document that was basically their position on why they support Donald Trump, like 6 pages worth of the sort of achievements that they see Trump has done for them as Christians. And there was some pretty shocking stuff. It's like he's banning transgender rights, and and this is all about pro-family values and all this. This is the party that's supporting Donald Trump, or I should say the evangelicals and the charismatic.
Yeah. One of my friends, I still have a few left. I've lost quite a few more this year, because I make a point to really speak out, and I let Christians know you're never going to live down this hypocritical stance that you've taken.
Yep.
I know your readers are telling you that this is God, but this is directly opposed to everything you claim Jesus stood for. So, so I've lost a lot of friends again this year because I just won't let it go. And
I'm with you.
And I've gotten, the closer the election has gotten, I've gotten more intense and probably meaner than I should have been, where I just said, thank you for letting, all you Christians that supported him. I want to thank you because you strengthened my belief that the God of the New Testament is complete and utter bullshit.
Yep.
Because you can't possibly be filled with the spirit of truth and be doing what you're doing. You can't possibly be filled with, you're supposedly God is love, and you're filled with God, and you're all for killing people all over the world and stealing children from their parents and sending their parents back to some country where we can't find them and keeping their children.
And you're okay with that.
Yeah. And you're supposedly pro-life.
Yeah. And, a vast majority of those Hispanics and people from South America and Mexico are Christians. This is something that I was talking with Frank Schaefer a couple of weeks ago for our podcast, and he made this point. I'd never thought of it this way, but the truth is a great majority of the immigrants that are coming from south of the border are themselves Catholics and Christians. Of all the people that they should be welcoming with open arms, it's fellow Christians. So it's complete and utter bullshit that they're turning them away at the border. And ironically, a great number of Latino voters actually voted for Trump, certainly in Florida. So these are actually more aligned with the Republican conservative side of politics.
Yes.
So it doesn't make any sense to turn them away. If they want to strengthen their base, that's a good place to start. And so it's got to be down to more racism than anything else, and xenophobia.
Yeah, but you can't convince them of that, because they're like, no, I have Hispanic people sitting right beside me in the pews, worshiping God with me every day. I fellowship with my Latinx brothers and sisters at work or all over. You can't convince them. at one point I was trying to get, I think it's at Penn State. I'm not sure. I learned it from Malcolm Gladwell. There's some university that runs a test. It's a psychological test. And they show you two pictures, a black person and a white person, right? It will flash up and you're supposed to tell which one's good, which one's bad. And they show you, this is the one that's good and this is the one that's bad. You know which one to choose. And in the US, it's unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. I was furious with myself how badly I failed the test. And everybody, including African Americans in America, fail this test because we're so programmed that racism is just, plus, it's biological as well, but
it is systemic.
Is just ingrained.
It is
in our culture. And I don't think you see it until you get out of the country. Honestly, and a lot of people who get out of the country don't see it either.
It's true, but we see it looking at it from across the pond and trying to explain. I mean, this whole week, all my British friends at work and my students are asking me, what the hell is going on? And I think maybe this is my last question. One of the things I'm shocked by is that, well, we didn't repudiate Donald Trump. That's the whole thing. We had our chance as Americans to put a line in the sand and say, no, we are repudiating this man and everything he stands for. And rather than doing that, more Americans voted for him than they did in 2016. It wasn't a case of I'm voting against Joe Biden. I am voting, they said, for Donald Trump. Yeah. So where's this thing going then? From an evangelical point of view, as both of us ex-evangelicals, where do you think the church is going to end up after 2020? Because if Biden wins, now they've got a new enemy to fight against.
A new conspiracy theory.
Yep.
A new spiritual warfare.
It'll be something else, won't it?
Yep. Number one, I'm still processing. I'm processing how do I continue to live in a country that is at least 48% for fascism,
and racism and xenophobia, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, etc., etc.
I really want to watch my words because I haven't processed it yet. Right. I don't know about you. You had to write a lot to get your PhD.
I did.
I'm a writer. I publish books and articles and whatnot. But I read long ago a writer who said, I haven't written about this, so I don't know what I think about it yet. And I realized many years ago that's how I process. I write. Other people talk it out, right? And so I'm trying to process this. I want to tell people, number one, if you don't have to be here in the United States for the next 5 to 10 years, don't be here. If you have a choice, make the choice not to be here. If you are anything other than a white, heterosexual, evangelical, racist American,
you don't want to be there.
If you have the means, the wise move is to leave.
Yep. That's sad to say, but it's true, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Because he's got people so on edge, especially his followers. They tried to run the Biden bus as he was going to campaign rallies. They were trying to run it off the road. They tried
a whole nother level.
That's the attempted assassination of a presidential candidate.
Yeah. And now they're showing up at polling places like in Arizona.
Yeah. They
ranting and raving, trying to stop the counts. And
some of them tried to push their way inside of these places to stop the vote. And, not just that, but somehow the Republicans picked up a governorship and they picked up multiple state houses.
Yeah.
And for those outside of America who don't understand that this is a census year. So in 2020, now we get to redraw districts for elections and representation. And when Republicans are in charge, they draw the districts in crazy shapes to make sure that they stay in charge, because they know, and Democrats do the same thing, but Republicans are incredibly evil about it.
Yeah, they're
and
masters of gerrymandering.
Yeah, and openly racist about it as well. But they know they can only win by voter suppression and cheating, because they just don't have enough votes. And so this is what they do. They cheat, they suppress votes, and they pick their voters instead of, they design districts so they pick their voters instead of voters picking them.
Yeah.
And it's going to get worse because these people are going to still be in charge. So I'm still trying to process it. For 5 years now, I've had delusion after delusion broken in my mind. And more than that, but I mean, really, it's been really bad in the last 5 years. I can't. I'm trying to process this with you right now, in real time. I've had all these delusions broken, and the latest delusion is we are at least 48% of the United States of America is pro-fascist, pro-racism, pro-bigotry, pro-violence against those you disagree with, pro-suppression. I mean, it just goes.
The list goes on.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking. It's horrifying, and it's like, honestly, I've always known there were still racists in America, always, right?
Sure.
We still have Nazis in America.
Yeah,
we still,
white supremacists and all the rest of it.
Down the road, we have, it's not far from me. It's like 30 minutes from me. We've got a Nazi complex where they've got swastikas out in public on the walls, and they get together and hang out together and teach each other Nazi propaganda. It's like, what the hell?
What's going on?
How are you this backward in 2020?
So we're saying America's got some very serious, deep-seated issues. Hopefully we can work through it. This is the question. Can we actually heal? Can we come together as a nation? I honestly don't know. I'm not sure. What's your take on it as we finish up? What's your final thought?
Honestly, I'm scared. I'm confused. I have 3 adult children. I have people that I know and love who are in the LGBTQ plus community. Being a musician, I have a deep love and respect for many people of color who are my friends and have been for many years. And getting through to people is increasingly difficult. And not only that, but number one, Biden made it clear. He made it very, very clear when he was running that he has no intentions of addressing any of the problems that have caused somebody like Trump to arise. And so the people that currently look like they're going to be the front runners next time, like Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and a few others that look like they're going to be the front runners in 2024, they're not going to be. It's going to be somebody worse than Trump, more militant, more violent, more angry. That's a scary thought. Yeah, I am very concerned. I'm confused. I'm scared, especially for my kids, for my nieces and nephews. I'm terrified for the world and the country that they're going to have to deal with. And I know for me personally, I don't have the wisdom to guide them through this. And so
that's heavy.
Yeah, it is, especially I don't at the moment, I don't know. That's a scary thing.
Yeah. I think for me, it's a case of continuing to educate myself, helping to educate other people. That's the only way I can see my own personal way forward, is to continue doing research and talking about this kind of stuff with people like you who come out of that background, because at least if you educate someone, they can maybe avoid certain pitfalls in the future and have some sort of talking points, maybe to reason with some of these mega hat wearing, blind, loyal Trump cult followers. I don't know if you can get through to them, but maybe one person at a time. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pretty much convinced that's the only thing that works. The problem is when you're doing one person at a time and there's so few people who are actually doing the work.
Yeah. Right? There's 60 plus million who voted for Trump at this point in time.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people to get through in 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah. But we only need to get to 5 or 10 million of them.
That's
right?
it, man. Well, listen, man, this has
yeah.
been great chat with you. I was going to ask you too, before we sign off, how can people find you? How can they get a hold of you? How can they get a hold of your podcast?
The podcast is the People I Meet podcast. Well, you can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's on all the major ones. I am Dean Krosecz on Twitter. You can follow me there. You'll put the link, right? Because my last name is crazy hard to spell for people. That's where they can get a hold of me. Twitter and the People I Meet podcast, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Very cool. Well, listen, Dean, thank you so much, man. We've had a really wide-ranging discussion for sure. We've covered a lot of ground, man, but let's definitely come back around. We need to do this again. We got a lot more things we can discuss once you and I both do some more writing, some research, some thinking about what we feel about all this, and especially as the election finally does somehow shake itself out,
some kind of resolution.
Maybe in a couple of months we can come back around and talk about this again.
You got it. And I'm happy to come and tell my story at some point as well.
Yeah, we didn't really get too much into that, so lots to talk about. All right, we'll definitely do this again. Thanks so much, Dean.
Thank you, Clint, man. Talk to you soon.